Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Clark. I'm the president here at EVERFI. Very excited to be and humbled and honored to be the one who's kicking off the webinar. I'm going to be introducing our panelists, Sandra and Carmen, in just a minute here, but I wanted to set the table for our event today and certainly take a minute to thank everyone who's joined us. This is certainly diversity and inclusion, just like harassment and discrimination, have become headline issues, board issues, C-level issues to an extent and degree that this country has never seen before. And it's certainly a complex and difficult time to work through these issues across industries and corporations and universities. To set the table a little bit about EVERFI and why this issue is so near and dear to us and why data in particular matters so much to us. We are an education company, an online education company that certainly spends a lot of our time working with corporations and universities around topics like sexual violence education, sexual harassment, diversity and inclusion, and other very intractable issues. And we do that at scale, and we serve thousands of organizations and institutions. But at the core of EVERFI, we are a mission-based business that focuses very much on impact, and impact means efficacy, it means data, it means understanding not only corporations, and thanks to so many of you who participated in the survey that we'll be showing and sharing today, but also what it means to understand climate at the employee level, and what attitudes and behaviors and knowledge gain we can be testing for as we all try to tackle these very difficult issues quarter over quarter, year over year with our workforce. As a brief introduction of myself, I run EVERFI's compliance and higher ed division, where, as I mentioned, we serve about 4,000 customers, and my background is both in law and in technology, and very, very excited to be with you today. Moving along, this certainly I want to get out of the way and get into the meat of this very quickly. I'd like to introduce our panelists, who are two of my favorite people here at EVERFI, and really proud of the work that they do every day, and I know that they're very excited to be presenting. Sandra Solovey, Esquire, Vice President of Content here at EVERFI. Sandra has been teaching, training, and writing on diversity, inclusion, and discrimination issues for almost 20 years. Millions of learners have experienced the award-winning e-learning courseware created under her leadership. Sandra graduated with honors from Brown University, and her law degree is from Berkeley Law. Dr. Carmen Poole, lead instructional writer at EVERFI. Carmen works, as does Sandra, with me here in our San Francisco East Bay office. She leads our instructional writer. She's a lead instructional writer at EVERFI and has built learning programs on diversity and inclusion used by hundreds of organizations and hundreds of thousands of learners. She earned her PhD in social justice education from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. With that, I will turn this over to Sandra and Carmen. Before I do, just some housekeeping, blocking and tackling issues. We will be sending out a recording of today's webinar as quickly as we can, probably sometime tomorrow morning or late in the evening tonight via email for everyone who registered. We will do our best to navigate through any live questions that come through, so you're welcome to use either the question box or the chat box that appears in the right sidebar of your screen. Again, if we don't get to your question, we will certainly follow up, but we will do our best to engage in those questions during the live event. And then additionally, post-event today, we'll also send resources and information about EVERFI and about the work we do, and if we can support your organization in any way in 2018, we'd certainly love the opportunity to do so. With that, I will pass it over to Sandra to kick us off today.
Great. Thank you so much, Preston. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll start off with a look at our agenda. We're going to kick off our time together with a quick interactive polling question. Then we'll share some of the background behind the survey, what inspired us to do the research, what our methodology was like. Next, we'll dig into highlights from the actual survey results and the related implications. Specifically, the financial resources companies are putting into diversity and inclusion initiatives. What are companies spending? Then we'll look broadly at what those initiatives are. How are we actually putting our diversity and inclusion principles into practice at our companies? Next, we'll focus on the data in a few specific areas. We'll look at diversity and inclusion training, popular tactics for recruitment, including strategies for recruiting diverse candidates, and we'll focus on metrics. We'll take a deeper dive into effectiveness to see how companies feel about the success of their programs. We'll consider motivating factors behind diversity and inclusion initiatives. And finally, we'll conclude with a summary of some of the common challenges that the companies we surveyed are facing and some ideas for addressing those top challenges. And then, as Preston said, we'll have some time for questions, I'm hoping, at that point. So let's start off. I'll turn this over to Carmen with our polling question.
Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, Preston. So yeah, to kick us off, we'd like to get a gauge of where the commitment might be located in your organization. So when it comes to your company's commitment to diversity and inclusion, is that commitment strong, top-down, and or well-established, average, employee-driven, and or new, or weak, few to no internal evangelists, unexamined, and or hostile? So we'll open up the poll right now and give you a few minutes to provide some feedback. Oh, excellent. Okay, so yeah, answers are rolling in. So far we have, this is interesting. So 28% so far, strong, top-down, and or well-established. 53% average, 18 weak. We'll give it a few more minutes, or a few more moments, sorry, for feedback.
How are the numbers looking, Carmen?
Sorry, at 82% voted, we currently have 29% have strong top-down or well-established commitment, 54% average, employee-driven and or new, and 17% weak, few to no internal evangelists, and unexamined or hostile. I don't know if this is surprising. I'm going to go ahead, Sandra, and I think 29% strong, top-down, well-established. I think that's a good number. I mean, obviously it could be better, but it's a surprising number for me.
Yeah, definitely could be worse, could also be better. It's interesting to see that 17% are really feeling sort of alone, that either the commitment is weak or there's hostility there, which is pretty sizable.
I think the other thing that I want to consider too is employee driven. I think that's a really big deal at 54%. It makes me think, again, as a lead instructional writer and trainer, how to actually speak to those employees in a way that actually amplifies up and down, but mostly up? How do we encourage and or reinforce this commitment for employees who might be able to amplify, you know, vertically in their organization? So this is really important feedback. Did you have anything else to add, Sandra, as far as this poll?
No, thank you so much, Carmen.
Okay, so moving on to what inspired the survey.
Sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty.
Okay. Well, we can go ahead. So in terms of what inspired the survey, most organizations recognize the need to invest in diversity and inclusion initiatives, but widespread adoption remains elusive. We still have a long way to go when it comes to knowing what success looks like and figuring out how to successfully create productive and equitable workplaces. We know that people have been working in earnest to appreciate, acknowledge, and foster diversity and inclusion, and we know that it's a bifurcated process, or at least now we acknowledge that it's a bifurcated process that must include building in demographic diversity at all levels within an organization and creating organizations that are committed to meaningful and transformative inclusion. We also know, at least from those organizations who publish their numbers publicly, that some diversity initiatives fall short of their goals, that year-over-year improvements are slight in many cases, and that many of us are still figuring out what effective, quote-unquote effective initiatives are, or what quote-unquote diversity successes look like. So given our relative position, and Preston alluded to this earlier, given our relative position as a solution-oriented training company, we wanted to begin to pull apart some of these challenges and opportunities through what I consider like a high-level preliminary needs assessment. So where are we? What do we need in this space? What have we been doing? What has and has not been working? What have we learned so far? Where do we need to be? And, you know, at least for us, most importantly, what can we do to help? So this survey was a first step in that sort of really broad but really important assessment. So moving on to methodology, for the survey, we had a sample size of 287 respondents, and the survey ran from September 27th to October 19th of this year. When crafting and thinking and distributing, and distributing this survey, we specifically targeted actively engaged human resource and compliance professionals working with or working adjacent to diversity and inclusion programs and initiatives. So now that I've sort of given a broad look at why we're doing this, why we decided to do this, what our interest was, why it's important, and how we went about doing it, I'd like to send it back to Sandra so we can begin our discussion of our diversity and inclusion survey results. Sandra?
Thank you so much, Carmen. Thanks for the background. Very helpful. So let's shift and talk about the survey results now. We can get a really good gut level understanding of the value companies place on their diversity and inclusion initiatives by looking at the budget allocations that are being made. So going in, we decided to assume nothing and start with the basics, just asking whether or not the company had actually dedicated any budget at all to diversity and inclusion initiatives. And as you can see here, the numbers were pretty close. So 41% said no budget was allocated. 35% said budget had been allocated, and 24% were not sure. Now, not being sure is an interesting response, right? Because it means that, even if there is some budget, it's not likely being used in a high-profile manner, because the respondents don't even know that there is a budget. So that one's interesting. While I feel like these results certainly could be better, the good news is that for about a third of companies, we are seeing some actual confirmed financial commitment to diversity and inclusion. We then asked, of that 35% that had yes, who knew that they had budget, what did those numbers actually look like? So of that group, 54%, just over half, had a budget that was $30,000 or under. And the other half had budgets ranging from $30,000 to $1 million. Of the companies with budgets of $30,000, 18% are in the $30,000 to $99,000 range. 17% fall in the $100,000 to $999,000 range, and 11% had a budget of over $1 million. We also asked about upcoming budgets. So interestingly, very few people anticipated their budgets decreasing, only 3%. We found that 49% of respondents expected no budget change at all, and a full 30% expected an increase in the budget. Now, this is good news, and it places some urgency on the question we'll be asking shortly about efficacy of diversity and inclusion projects. If we have the same or more budget, how do we want to allocate that? For those who expect to lose budget, and even though it is a very small fraction of respondents, at 3%, this question of efficacy is even more important because, in that situation, knowing which initiatives to continue and which you can let go is really critical. Now let's take a look at the different ways that our research found that companies are manifesting their diversity and inclusion efforts. How are companies practicing diversity and inclusion? So this is an interesting finding. I know there's a lot of information coming at you pretty quickly, but this one, I'm going to ask you to keep this in mind for when we talk about some of the challenges later on in the webinar. So in this question, we asked respondents to focus specifically on the last 2 years. And just by a hair, just by 1%, but it turns out technically more than half of our respondents are tracking diversity metrics at their organizations. Okay, so just keep that in mind, more on that later. We did see nearly half, 48%, are doing salary evaluations to ensure fair pay. Both metrics and salary evaluations can be a low profile, sort of behind the scenes approach, so I was very taken by the results that relate to training. 44% of companies are engaging in company-wide diversity and inclusion or civility training. So because these initiatives are company-wide, in addition to the benefit the training itself provides, this type of initiative does a sort of double duty. It's a very highly visible way for organizations to signal commitment to the principles of diversity, inclusion. Next up, we see 41% using transparent evaluation and performance reviews, which helps with diversity and inclusion, also functions as a risk mitigation strategy. From there, we started to see several more, what I'll call more concentrated diversity and inclusion efforts, including diversity councils being used by 38% of our respondents. Employee resource groups exist at 35% of our responding companies. And finally, we saw a solid number of organizations making a significant commitment via mentorship programs for underrepresented groups at 27%. Diversity and inclusion officers exist at just over a quarter of companies at 26%. And specific career development programs focused on underrepresented groups are happening at 18% of our surveyed organizations. So a lot of good information there, and great to see how organizations are actually practicing that commitment to diversity and inclusion. Now, I wanted to pause for a minute here and take a moment to look more closely specifically at training. More than half of respondents affirmatively report that their companies have used diversity and inclusion training. Most of that training was made mandatory at 67%. How are companies training? At 45%, almost half of the training was a combination of online and in-person training. Of the remainder, a little over 2/3, which was 40% total, was in-person exclusively, and just under 1/3 of that remaining portion was online only. So, in other words, 13% of all companies training are doing so online only. I'm sorry, it's 15%. But the majority, around 60% of all diversity and inclusion training includes online training components, which is definitely an interesting trend and not at all surprising from where I sit, given the benefits of digital training for this type of content and for ease of deployment. So training is a strategy that's often used to create and foster an inclusive climate so that diverse employees will feel comfortable staying at a particular company. But what about actually recruiting diverse candidates to start with? We looked at how companies are bringing diverse folks in the door and found that solidly half of the organizations say they are actively searching for members of underrepresented groups. That exact figure was 57%. Almost half of respondents at 47% have taken the step of reviewing job postings and removing biased language. Now, I was actually surprised at this one. The number was surprisingly low to me, honestly, given the low barrier of entry. It doesn't typically take that much investment to audit your open job recs, at least in a rolling fashion. In fact, typically this type of review should be ongoing anyway. So, in my view, clearly some room for improvement on this one. By contrast, a full 39% were sponsoring events specifically targeting underrepresented groups, which is actually a much more complicated initiative than auditing your open job recs. At 26%, more than a quarter of companies were following best practices, removing demographic details from applications to anonymize them. 22% required advanced diversity and inclusion training for their HR managers, which is a very helpful thing to do. And 16% were affirmatively partnering with colleges to offer scholarships to underrepresented groups, which definitely takes coordination and investment. Now I'll hand it over to Carmen to walk us through the results. I think we're starting with metrics.
Thanks, Sandra. So transparency about diversity and inclusion. This is one of my favorite sort of areas, so let me just go ahead before I get excited. When it came to transparency about diversity and inclusion, our survey found that more than half of respondents, or 54%, said that their company does not publish diversity metrics internally or externally. 21% publish their metrics internally only, 5% report externally, and only 20% publish their metrics both internally and externally. Additionally, of those respondents who actually track their diversity and inclusion metrics, only 26% said that their company does not publish their metrics at all, while 40% do so internally, 6% do so externally, and 28% report both internally and externally. So what does this tell us I think taken together, these two findings are really quite illuminating. However, rather than focusing on how few companies publish their diversity and inclusion metrics, so 54% is, pretty dismaying, from a diagnostic perspective, or again, as I said, putting the needs assessment hat on, it's extremely important to note that companies who actively track their diversity metrics also tend to report them. So even if this was read superficially, it's fair to assume that companies who measure their metrics use the data that they collect. That 35% publish their numbers externally is significant to me, because we know from a compliance perspective that a willingness to speak publicly to shortcomings and the need for improvement tends to implicate everyone, especially if we consider the fact that we can't change what we don't acknowledge. This also underscores the institutional responsibility and ownership of the need to improve, which I think is extremely important in this diversity and inclusion space. So in essence, this transparency could well be interpreted as a stand-in or a reflection of, or evidence of a true commitment to real change. So ultimately, if companies who do track their D&I metrics tend to report the numbers, it suggests that an active tracking program advances an internal commitment to diversity and inclusion within an organization. So this is on the transparency end and the measurement end. We'll go to the next slide, which speaks to effectiveness, or at least our generalized understanding or our generalized really impression of the effectiveness of a diversity and inclusion initiatives. So a plurality, not a majority, say that diversity and inclusion initiatives are effective at 39%, but the results were divided in terms of the 34% who say diversity and inclusion initiatives are not effective, and the 27% who say that they do not know. So, looking at the question, how would you rate the effectiveness of your diversity and inclusion initiatives? It's definitely worth noting here that, I'm acknowledging the fact that the use of the term effective in the diversity and inclusion context is really subjective. But to be fair and assume that most respondents have a reasonable and informed appreciation for the state of their organization's diversity and inclusion landscape, the survey finding, this survey finding in particular, tells us that we have a good deal more work to do. So again, that 27% of respondents don't know whether or not their diversity and inclusion initiatives are effective is really, to me, the most alarming number here. And the only way to sort of quote unquote not know how different initiatives are landing would be to not have active measurement programs related to either evaluation or assessment or failure to define benchmarks or longer term goals. So the question here is, what is the point of creating diversity and inclusion programs that can't be improved via clear goals, clear incentives, and a comprehensive evaluation and assessment? So for me, particularly from a training perspective, I look at this pie chart and I'm thinking, we definitely need to work on what we're measuring, how we're measuring, what benchmarks we are setting. And even if we are setting benchmarks, because I know that that's not uncommon, but how are we measuring our meeting of those benchmarks? And, I'll say this sort of preemptively, how do we do so in a way that is both quantitative and qualitative, which I think really is the challenge that we're taking on here. So on the next slide, when it comes to how their company compares to other comparable organizations, so we asked the question, thinking about how your company compares to others in your sector, does your company do more, about the same, or less than other companies to promote diversity internally. So 31% of respondents said their company does about the same as others in their sector. 25% say they do more than other companies, and 19% say they do less than other companies. And again, a significant minority responded that they do not know. So here, this looks like a pretty even split between organizations who do more, do the same, or do less than comparable companies. Again, the fact that a quarter of respondents just don't know how they compare to companies within their sector is illuminating. One question that emerges from this particular finding is what is, and I encourage everyone on the call to think about this, what is or what would be the perceived value, the real or perceived value of actually knowing where your company might fall within the spectrum of active diversity and inclusion engagements or initiatives among companies of comparable size and sector. So the question, again, following the rabbit hole, would evaluating what we are all doing via a comparative approach push us further in the right direction to drive innovation, through this comparing of notes within the diversity and inclusion space? And from the perspective of a needs assessment or, training hat on, this survey finding in particular inspires more questions than it answers, but that's really valuable when it comes to the internal evaluations of where we are, where we should be, where our various industries are headed, and how we might learn valuable insights from each other. Which leads us to the next slide, why conduct diversity and inclusion initiatives? And this is, again, one of the findings that I find quite compelling. Given the lack of clarity on effectiveness, or whether or not we're all agreeing on what is effective, what is not effective, the definition, and the makeup of what that might mean, why do companies engage in diversity and inclusion initiatives? Our survey suggests that more than 7 in 10 say that they use diversity and inclusion initiatives because they reinforce their company's values at 72%, which is remarkable. And other top motivating factors are increasing a company's appeal to diverse candidates at 67%, promoting equity in the workplace at 66%. Also, that's a great finding. And improving relationships among employees at 64%. So depending on what chair you are sitting in, the fact that 46% reported enhancing their company's reputation was a motivating factor, and mitigating risk. I mean, I don't know if this is a drop. I can't speak to whether this is a drop in percentage. I'd like to think that it's a drop in this percentage, that 35% report mitigating risk as a motivating factor is extremely telling. And I mean, you'll see at the bottom, satisfying legal settlement at 16%. So the way I read these, really fantastic results, it suggests, or these numbers suggest that the majority of respondents are no longer, or we'll say have never been, I don't want to editorialize here, but that they are not engaged in diversity and inclusion initiatives in a way that is might be considered cynical or superficial, but that these companies have reconciled the value and necessity of diversity and inclusion with their own company's values, and the company's appeal to talent, and frankly, a more lofty ideal such as actually promoting equity, and that those things are meaningful. From a needs assessment perspective, I think that this helps us quiet the concern that these initiatives are window dressing only. And I know that we've probably all for, checking boxes and the like. But that the space we may be moving into, refreshingly, we no longer need to speak to the why of diversity and inclusion. I do still think that that's an important part of this conversation. Risk mitigation, legal requirements, but we can actually shift our focus, from training, from internal initiatives, from overall sort of company values, but that we can shift our focus into the how of diversity and inclusion, and this includes reconciling the importance of it to values-based improvements within our organizations. And, having worked in this space for a little while now, this is really, this is fantastic. This is good news, because we tend to focus on business case arguments, social justice case arguments, justifying or trying to explain why we are engaged in these initiatives. And it feels from results like this that we've moved beyond the point of explaining why we're doing this, and we're now sort of earnestly reconciling values with how we want to walk through the world, or how we want to be viewed, or how we actually want to be, as opposed to more, practical reasons for increasing numbers, and, focusing on less philosophically lofty ideals when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I do think that has a huge impact on our commitment to making these things work within our organizations. So next slide. And this is sort of I guess, more obvious results. Nothing too surprising here. In terms of what are the top motivating factors and how do they relate to sort of the role within an organization, motivation for conducting diversity and inclusion initiatives is not uniform across professions. The respondents who participated in our survey, those who worked in human resources, were more likely to say that increasing a company's appeal to diverse candidates, again, as Sandra mentioned earlier, the recruitment was a motivating factor for these initiatives. And respondents who worked in compliance were more likely to say that mitigating risk is a motivating factor. So for human resources professionals, 77% saw that increasing company appeal to diverse candidates was the motivating factor, compared to 50% in compliance. And for mitigating risk, 34% of human resource professionals felt that was a motivating factor, as opposed to 47% in compliance. And I will now turn it back to Sandra to begin a discussion about the challenges that we face.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I feel so inspired when I hear you talking about that particular slide where we're starting to see and feel that shift from, sort of defending why diversity and inclusion initiatives should exist, to really being able to look at, hey, how do we do this stuff better? What works? So thank you so much for pointing that out and putting your spin on it. It's a really helpful way to understand that data. So given that we're able to start making this shift, we wanted to explore the top challenges that are being faced related to diversity and inclusion initiatives. The biggest issue, which was reported by 52% of the companies, so over half, is lack of measurable impact. And truly, I actually think that's good news, because tracking that data is really doable. It shouldn't be an insurmountable hurdle. Just as one example, with training initiatives, measuring changes in knowledge, doing pre and post assessments is very straightforward. And, a well-designed assessment instrument can track not just knowledge, but change in attitudes and even changes in likely behavior. So showing some return on that training investment, at least related to knowledge, attitude, and behaviors is very possible. And really fascinating to me to see that companies are still considering that to be so challenging. Now, a tougher but a related problem is the lack of budget. That was a large hurdle faced by 42% of respondents. 39% of our respondents reported difficulty getting folks involved and interested. That is a big issue. It's often about the engagement of the initiative and about the related awareness and messaging that goes along with it, and putting some more attention to that. 29% of companies reported trouble creating a plan and getting organized. So this is actually a very sizable group of folks who are, basically looking for guidance, who are being stymied by some sort of lack of leadership or direction. 27% are constrained by a lack of appropriate resources. And coming in at the end of the list, 26% of companies report difficulty getting support from senior executives. So I'm glad that this is the least common of the common problems on our list, because I do think that this one is one of the harder ones to tackle. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's certainly not impossible. It absolutely can be done. But it is one of the more challenging ones compared to some of the others on the list. When we break the challenges down by respondents, we notice that folks who are coming from the HR side of the house tend to report larger challenges with employee involvement, whereas respondents coming out of compliance were much more concerned with lack of measurable impact. And there shouldn't be really any surprises there. So 45% of HR respondents said difficulty getting employees involved is a challenge, compared to only 32% of compliance respondents who were especially concerned. On the other hand, 63% of compliance respondents cite measurable impact as a challenge, compared to 50% of human resources respondents. Now, you remember at the beginning of the webinar, I asked you to kind of make a mental note that 51% of respondents were tracking diversity metrics at their organizations. So I know there's been a lot in between when we talked about that and right now, but I wanted to come back to that point as one of the easier fixes for this challenge about measurable impact. And remember, while there is more of a concern for compliance folks here about measurable impact, it still is a concern for half of our human resources respondents. So it's still a big concern for both groups. And basically what we discovered on that earlier slide at the beginning is it's essentially a flip of the coin as to whether diversity metrics are being tracked. And the trouble with that is, if folks are not tracking their numbers, then there's no baseline. And then this becomes a really vicious cycle, because it's harder to show impact because you don't have your baseline. So it's harder to get budget for your initiatives, which we know is an issue because we're seeing that here in the respondents. And so without the budget for the initiatives, it's then harder to track, and it's harder to measure impact, and so on and so on. So one really simple first step is to be sure that where you're doing training initiatives, that they are data smart, or that you can make them data smart in the future at least. Meaning that you can gather some information, some pre and post information to show successes and gaps, and that you can easily track your completion so you know if folks are actually participating and how well. So next, I'd love to invite Carmen. I'd love to invite you to come back and share your insights and conclusions from a high level based on the overall survey data?
Sure, Sandra. Thank you. I actually wanted to address one question just before I go into concluding remarks. There was a question for clarification whether respondents say that diversity and inclusion initiatives are not effective at all, or whether their organization's diversity and inclusion initiatives are not effective. So this was very specifically that they did not find that their companies' diversity and inclusion initiatives were successful or effective, sorry, not successful. So I just wanted to make sure I made that distinction. It's a huge distinction. So that one jumped out at me. We definitely, I mean, it obviously would be a very interesting conversation, like writ large or at your company specifically, but in this, within the context of the survey, we're specifically asking, within your organization. So by way of conclusion, our survey found that relatively few companies have fully invested in diversity and inclusion. Only about a third, or 35% of respondents, say that their company has a budget for diversity and inclusion initiatives, and only about half, or 52% of respondents, say that their company has used diversity and inclusion training. Tracking diversity metrics are at the top, or the most popular way companies practice diversity and inclusion. So again, respondents cited tracking diversity metrics as the most common way of evaluating diversity and training inclusion at their company. Other popular ways of tracking diversity and inclusion include conducting salary evaluations, which is extremely important to ensure fair pay, and implementing company-wide diversity and inclusion training. So in terms of, again, diversity metrics, it's very demographic, or it can tend towards the easily measurable demographic HIRS sort of content that you would measure within an organization. And lastly, the jury is still out on the effectiveness of diversity and inclusion training. And as I mentioned earlier, I think this is where, some of, at least what my focus will be, that respondents were divided on the impact of diversity and inclusion training in their organization specifically. 39% saying that initiatives. 39% saying that diversity and inclusion initiatives were effective, 34% not effective, and 27% they did not know whether it was effective or not. And I think this is, given the slide identifying all the different initiatives, there are certain things that are trending downward in terms of we're now being a little bit more critical about our use and application of employee resource groups that were very popular, say, in the 80s. And I think not that they're no longer popular, but they're no longer as popular because I think their effectiveness has been called into question only because we maybe have failed to measure how much impact they have on employees, but also fail to acknowledge or calculate or problematize how much either autonomy or voice they may have within an organization. So you can have an employee resource group, but if it's simply a place for people to meet and not actually actively engage management or leadership within, to be able to respond or preemptively respond to certain things within the organization, I do think that there's been a lot of discussion around the effectiveness of ERG specifically. So that is essentially that's essentially the meatiest part of the survey. These are the findings that we've come away with. I hope that I've identified at least things that suggest that we're moving in the right direction. But I do think that when it comes to budgets, when it comes to actually distinguishing which initiatives may have more purchase than others, this survey is going to be very helpful in terms of identifying what next steps need to be taken in this needs assessment that needs to basically focus on, you know, the numbers and the stats, but also, you know, more qualitative aspects that we may have been missing along the way.